The message wasn't long, but it was enough to fracture the silence. Julian sat in the dark, only the faint hum of the refrigerator behind him. The voice memo had arrived 7 minutes ago. It played back in the same broken tone every time. "If you're hearing this, I didn't mean for it to go this far." Matthew's voice, his lawyer, usually sharp and calculating, was now panicked, low, scared. "They know I talked. I'm sorry, Julian." It ended like that. No explanation. No goodbye. Julian hadn't moved since. The phone felt heavier in his hand. Outside, the sky was turning black. The kind of black that didn't just signal night. It signaled warning. His eyes scanned the room, landing on the law degree that had once meant protection. Now it looked like a taunt. And then, under his breath, almost too quiet to matter, Julian whispered, "What did you do?" But deep inside, he already knew. Something was coming. And it had his name on it. Julian didn't sleep. The city continued on outside his window, unaware of the crack that had split through his night. Hours passed. He stayed curled on the couch, phone in hand, mind looping back to Matthew's voice. He could hear it without even pressing play now. "They know I talked." Talked to who? About what? Julian hadn't spoken to Matthew in weeks, not since the last case wrapped. But this wasn't about a case. This wasn't legal. This was darker, deeper. At 3:22 a.m., Julian finally stood. The apartment felt foreign. Each creak in the floorboards sounded too loud. He walked to the window but didn't look out. Instead, he looked at his reflection in the glass, hollow-eyed, uncertain. He whispered to it, "What have you dragged me into?" The reflection didn't answer, but something in it looked back. It had been years since Julian had thought about the warehouse fire. The story buried under layers of courtroom smoke and sealed transcripts. But now, everything felt tied to that one week in 2017. And Matthew, brilliant, smug Matthew, had handled it all like it was routine. Too clean. Too smooth. Julian had questioned it once. Matthew gave him a stare that froze his blood and said, "You're not here to understand. You're here to walk away." And Julian had. Until now. The memory burned fresh as he stood before the cracked law degree. On instinct, he removed it from the wall. It felt heavier than it should. Behind the back panel, a folded paper. No, a photograph. Black and white. Faded. A man standing beside a warehouse, barely visible. But it wasn't Matthew. And it wasn't Julian. So who the hell was it? The photo was dated. Julian flipped it over. Scribbled in faded ink was August 18, 2017. The date of the fire. His stomach sank. That fire was supposed to be an accident. 5 people dead, all unnamed. But someone had taken this picture before it happened. The man in it stood like a sentinel, unaware he was being watched. Julian's hand shook as he studied it. This wasn't evidence. This was leverage. And it had been hidden. Behind the one thing Matthew used to shield himself. A symbol of legitimacy. Julian realized with a sinking heart. This wasn't carelessness. This was a message Matthew left on purpose. A breadcrumb. A warning. Or maybe a confession. Either way, Julian wasn't looking at a mystery anymore. He was looking at a threat. The buzz startled him. One vibration. Then, another. No caller ID. Just a number. The first message said, "You're not safe." The second, "They're watching." 5 seconds later, both messages vanished. No record. No backup. Julian's blood went cold. He checked his windows. Closed. Blinds down. Door locked. He pulled the battery from his phone, crushed the SIM underfoot, and tossed it in the sink. He felt eyes on him. Not paranoia. Certainty. The photograph still sat on the table, face up, as if it too was watching. For the first time since the message, Julian felt exposed. Not legally. Existentially. He didn't know who they were. But they knew him. And now, they knew he knew. Julian dug through boxes he hadn't touched in years. Case files, court transcripts, paper memories he tried to forget. But now he needed to remember. Everything. There was one case. The one Matthew never let him read in full. The file was sealed, redacted, sanitized. But Julian had kept a copy of the original intake notes. He found it at the bottom of the box, under tax papers and useless old leases. The folder smelled like mold and sweat. Inside, names. Dates. A photo of a girl, maybe 19, bruised and crying. Julian barely remembered her. She was a witness. But Matthew had said she didn't hold up. That phrase echoed now like a warning. Julian traced the girl's name with his finger. Ella Raines. Where had she gone? Why had she vanished from the file after the second hearing? And more importantly, why had Matthew told him to forget her? There was one person who might know. Natalie Chen, an intern from the original case, now working in a public defender's office across town. Julian hadn't spoken to her in years, not since the trial ended. He remembered her voice, skeptical, sharp. The kind that always asked too many questions. He called 3 times. No answer. On the 4th she picked up. Julian. Her voice held surprise. And something else. Fear. I shouldn't be talking to you, she said. They monitor everything now. He asked about Ella. Silence. Then. She was never a witness, Julian. She was a target. They only let her testify so they could make her disappear legally. The line went dead. Julian stared at the phone. His mouth was dry. What had Matthew done? Julian found Ella's name in a private database he wasn't supposed to have access to anymore. Former client lists, sealed witness registries, forgotten back doors from his paralegal days. There she was. Address, unknown to her. Status, archived. Last contact, July 2017. A red flag marker hovered beside her name. Julian clicked it. Access denied. It didn't make sense. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't even part of the case officially. So why was her file sealed by a Homeland Security division? He leaned back in his chair, stomach twisting. The cartel wasn't just drug runners or hackers. This was institutional. Organized. And Matthew, his friend, his legal savior, had handed them people. Quietly. Legally. Efficiently. Like it was just part of the paperwork. That night, Julian couldn't sleep. Not just because of what he'd learned, but because of the feeling that he was being watched. Again. The air in his apartment felt thinner, the corners darker. At 2:41 a.m., he heard a sound. Soft. Intentional. A tap. Then another. He stood, silent, bare feet brushing the cold floor. He approached the door. No peephole. He opened it half an inch, and saw nothing. But when he looked down, there was something on the floor. A plain white envelope. No markings. No return address. Just his name, handwritten in blue ink. He brought it inside, opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a photo. Him and Matthew. Outside a courthouse. And behind them, barely visible, was the same man from the warehouse photo. Watching. Julian sat alone, the envelope open on the table. The photo staring back at him. Not just a warning, a timeline. That photo was taken before the trial. Before the fire. Which meant the man watching them had always been there. The cartel wasn't some faceless enemy. It had eyes. It had timing. It had records. He noticed something else. Written faintly in the photo's margin, almost invisible unless tilted under the light, "She's still alive." His heart skipped. Ella. Duh. Was it possible? Or was this a trap? Another manipulation? Either way, someone wanted him to keep digging. or to dig his own grave. Julian lit a cigarette with shaking hands. He hadn't smoked in years. He needed to think. But his thoughts were now crowded, with faces, shadows, and lies that stretched far deeper than law ever touched. Julian drove across the city without knowing where he was going. The morning sun didn't rise. It just bled through the clouds like a wound. The city moved around him, but he felt invisible inside his car. He ended up outside the courthouse, the one where it all began. He sat across the street, watching. The benches, the pigeons, the tourists, all innocent, all unaware. And then he saw someone. A man in a gray coat. Just standing, facing the building. Julian's chest tightened. It wasn't the man from the warehouse. Not exactly. But the posture was identical. The stillness. The waiting. He took out his phone to snap a photo, but by the time he raised it, the man was gone. Like smoke. Julian didn't even remember him walking away. That was the moment he stopped trusting his memory. Julian pulled into a payphone stall, one of the last still standing in the city. He didn't trust his phone anymore. He dialed the only number he remembered from the intake list. Ella's emergency contact. Disconnected. Of course. He tried again. A different number. This number is no longer in service. Click. Dot. Static. Then unexpectedly, a voice cut through. Not a recorded one, a real one. Female. Dot. Stop looking. The line went dead before he could respond. His hand trembled around the receiver. He looked around, suddenly aware of every window, every car. He was exposed. The air outside felt thinner, heavier. That voice, calm, cold, final. It wasn't a warning. It was a command. And it came from somewhere watching. Somewhere close. He stopped by his old firm's office building, unannounced. Security had changed. The receptionist didn't recognize him. He gave a fake name, waited in the lobby under flickering lights. When no one came, he wandered toward the stairwell. Each step echoed too loudly. The fifth floor looked abandoned. Empty desks, old nameplates. Then, Matthew's old office door. Still there. He pushed it open. Dust. Silence. Papers left in drawers, untouched. He rummaged through the cabinet, then the trash bin. Nothing made sense. Then he found it, under the rug. A flash drive taped beneath a loose tile. Black, unmarked. He stared at it. Something about it felt like a line he wasn't supposed to cross. But it was too late not to. Julian returned home and plugged the drive into an offline laptop, one he hadn't used since law school. No network, no sync, no trace. The folder opened with no password. Inside, photos. Dozens. Courtrooms. Died with hallways. Empty chairs. And then, faces. His. Matthew's. Ella's. Natalie's. All time-stamped. Some surveillance. Some from angles only a hidden camera could catch. One video. He hesitated, then clicked. Grainy. A warehouse, same as the photo. Inside, cages. Real, metal, human-sized cages. Someone moved between them. A shadow. Julian paused the video. Rewound. Die. It wasn't a stranger. It was Matthew. Clipboard in hand. No mask. No disguise. Calm. Zims. Julian slammed the laptop shut like it might bite. The silence afterward was louder than anything. Julian couldn't breathe. He opened a window. Stumbled to the sink. Splashed water on his face. But nothing helped. The image burned into him. Matthew walking between cages, like it was just another day at the office. Julian felt sick. Not from the horror, but from the realization. Matthew hadn't changed. He had always been this. Julian had just chosen not to see it. Every win in court. Every miraculous dismissal. They were trades. Quiet exchanges. People disappeared so others could walk free. That's why he always told Julian not to ask, not to look. Because if you look, you're complicit. Julian looked. Now, he couldn't look away. The question wasn't how far does it go. The question was, how long until it swallows me too? The next day, Julian sat across from Natalie Chen in the back booth of a diner that hadn't been renovated since the 1970s. She looked older, sharper, less idealistic. I shouldn't be here, she said, stirring coffee that had gone cold. Julian slid the flash drive across the table. I saw him. In the warehouse. Natalie didn't flinch. She nodded slowly, then said something that cracked the ground beneath him. Matthew wasn't working for them, Julian. He was building them. Julian blinked. What do you mean? She leaned in. They didn't find him. He created the system. The pipeline. He used the courts, the clients, us, all of us, to feed it. Julian tried to speak, but nothing came out. He started it 10 years ago, she added. And you helped him? You just didn't know. But Julian did know, pieces of it. Somewhere deep inside he'd always known. The memories hit like a freight train. The girl from the deposition who vanished. The judge who suddenly recused himself. The client who confessed and then disappeared into protective custody. None of it had seemed strange in the moment, because Matthew was always 2 steps ahead, always explaining things with charm and certainty. But charm was camouflage. Julian thought back to that one conversation, years ago, late at night after a trial. He'd asked Matthew if he ever felt bad winning cases he shouldn't. Matthew had smiled and said, "Guilt is a liability." Julian had laughed then. Now the laughter echoed like a scream. He hadn't just been blind, he'd been complicit. Willingly. And now he had to ask himself something that scared him more than anything. How much of this was Matthew, and how much was him? Julian needed answers. Not whispers. Not shadows. He drove to the last address he had for Matthew, a luxury condo overlooking the water. The lobby was empty. The elevator felt too slow. Each ding stretched time. The door to 15B was slightly open. He knocked anyway. No answer. Inside, silence. Clean floors. Cold air. No photos. No personal items. It wasn't a home. It was a front. And on the table, as if waiting for him, another envelope. Inside, a single sheet of paper. One sentence, handwritten, "You're not supposed to be here." Julian backed away. His hands started to shake. Behind him, the door creaked closed. A breath. A shadow moved. He turned, fast, but there was no one there. Just absence. Intentional absence. He ran. He didn't remember choosing to, but his feet carried him down the hallway, down the stairs, out into the sunlight like it might burn away the fear. The street felt wrong, too quiet. He didn't know where to go. Every part of the city now looked different, like the curtain had been pulled back. He passed a police cruiser and realized for the first time in his life that he didn't know if they were here to help him or follow him. He ducked into an alley, hands on knees, breathing heavy. He felt like he was being hunted, not for what he'd done, but for what he finally understood. The cartel wasn't just in the dark. It was the dark. And Matthew was the architect. Not a lawyer. A gatekeeper. Julian returned home and locked every door. He stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. He didn't recognize the man staring back. His phone buzzed again. One new message. No contact. No subject. Just a video file. Against every instinct, he opened it. It showed Matthew sitting in an empty courtroom, looking directly at the camera. "You were never the client, Julian," he said. "You were the product." The video ended. Julian stood in silence. There were no more questions now. No more theories. Only the truth. Grotesque, personal, and irreversible. He wasn't just part of the machine. He was the machine. And somewhere, deep in the unseen layers of law, commerce and silence, Matthew had written his name into the system like a signature on a contract. One that could never be erased. Julian didn't plan the confrontation. He didn't even plan to survive it. He only knew he had to see Matthew in person. He used the oldest trick in the book, filing a subpoena under a closed case they'd both worked on. Matthew wouldn't ignore that. He didn't. They met in a private conference room in a law library no one used anymore. Julian was already there when Matthew walked in, calm as ever. "You look tired," Matthew said. Julian stood in silence. Then, "Why me?" Matthew blinked once. "Because you were good. Honest. People believe honest men." There was no remorse in his voice. Not even pride. Just precision. Julian wanted to scream, but instead he whispered, "You ruined lives." Matthew sat down. "No, Julian. I placed them. That's what power does. It allocates." And suddenly, Julian realized, Matthew didn't think he was evil. He thought he was necessary. Julian slammed the flash drive on the table. "This is evidence. This is proof." Matthew didn't even look down. "It's perspective," he said. "The law is just a language. I speak it better than most." Julian felt something inside him break. Not rage, not fear. Something quieter. Trust. Ding. Trust in systems, in outcomes, in justice. They were people, he said. Not assets, not statistics. Matthew stood now, slow and deliberate. "And what would you do, Julian? Turn me in? To who? The same people who used me." That stopped Julian cold. Because the truth was undeniable, Matthew wasn't a rogue actor. He was a fixture, a cog. The machine didn't want him gone. It needed him. And if Julian took him down, there would be 10 more waiting to take his place. But still, someone had to be first. Julian recorded the conversation. He had the audio, the context, the confession. But as he sat in his car afterward, parked outside the library, the weight of it crushed him. He couldn't just walk into a station and hand it over. Who would believe it? Worse, who would care? The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. Matthew's words repeated in his head. The law is just a language. Julian realized he'd been speaking the wrong one his entire career. Everything he fought for had been a lie dressed in procedure. He looked down at the flash drive. Not as a key, but as a death sentence. If he released it, everything would burn. If he didn't, he'd rot with it. There was no winning, only choosing which truth he could live with. He drove to the only journalist he trusted, someone who'd once lost their career chasing the story that got buried. Her name was Ava Marin. She lived off the grid now. Julian found her in a small cabin 2 hours out, hidden in the trees. She opened the door, expression unreadable. "You look like hell," she said. "You look like someone who'll listen," Julian replied. He told her everything. Showed her the files. The photos. The recording. She didn't blink. When he finished, she said only this. "I'll publish it. But you understand, they'll erase you." Julian nodded. "I'd rather be erased for telling the truth than live as part of a lie." She took the flash drive. Then, "This is war." For the first time in days, Julian felt something close to peace. Not safety, but purpose. Julian returned to the city before sunrise. The streets were empty, the skyline distant and cold. He sat on a rooftop overlooking it all, waiting. Not for safety, but for consequence. He knew they'd come. Whether it was police, feds, or something less official. He had crossed a line. And there's no crossing back. He looked out over the concrete maze, breathing the poisoned peace of a man who had finally told the truth. His phone buzzed once. A message from Ava. "It's out." He smiled. Not because it was over, but because it had begun. Somewhere, someone was reading what they were never meant to see. Somewhere, a system flinched. And that was enough. For now. The story broke. Not quietly. It spread like gasoline on fire. Julian watched from a motel room. Lights off, TV muted. Ava's article was everywhere, mirrored, reposted, dissected. The footage. The names. The trail of silenced witnesses. The collapse began not with sirens, but with silence. People started disappearing, not just from offices but from websites, from databases. And still, Matthew hadn't been arrested. He hadn't even been named. Julian stared at the news ticker. Alleged legal exploitation, ring linked to unnamed officials. That was it. No charges. No photos. Just smoke. Because the deeper the system, the better it buries its roots. Julian whispered, it wasn't enough. Not to destroy it. But maybe, to disturb it. That was something. Ava went underground. The site was pulled within 48 hours, but it didn't matter. The story was out, floating in corners of the internet no one could scrub. She messaged once more. They're trying to erase the source. Stay off grid. Julian left the motel that night. No goodbye. No trail. He shaved his beard, changed clothes, ditched his phone. He wasn't running. Not exactly. He was disappearing by choice. Every system he once trusted was now a weapon. Law. Will. Identity. Even memory. That was the scariest part. How fast the world forgets. A week later, no one mentioned the article. Not the news. Not social media. Nothing. Nothing. Like it never happened. And maybe, for the world, it hadn't. But for Julian, it would never be undone. He had stared too long into the machine. And now, it stared back. Somewhere deep in the city, Matthew was still practicing law. Quietly. Confidently. Untouched. Julian heard whispers, firms shielding him, files sealed, judges retiring early. No charges. No exposure. That's how the real system works. It doesn't fight you. It absorbs the truth. Dilutes it. Julian knew now. Justice was a story. One that needed the right villain, the right ending, and most importantly, a hero. But there were no heroes here. Only survivors. He walked past a newsstand one morning. The cover read, Truth or Fiction? The Rise of Legal Conspiracy Theories. A photo of a courtroom beneath it. The same courtroom from the flash drive. Julian laughed once, bitter. They had already rewritten it. Rebranded it. He walked on. He didn't look back. Julian started writing. Not for exposure. Not for revenge. For memory. Because someone had to remember. He used old notebooks, handwriting every detail he could recall. The cases, the faces, the moments where he chose silence. Each page became an act of defiance. A record no system could erase. Some nights he'd pause, staring at the paper. His hands would tremble. Not from fear, from grief. Grief for the version of himself who believed in the law. That man was gone. Buried under courtrooms and conference tables and flash drives. But in his place was something harder. Sharper. What? A man who knew what not to forget. And that, maybe, was enough. Not to win, but to remember. One evening, Julian burned the original flash drive. No backups. No copies. Just flame. It wasn't fear. It was release. The truth was already out. In Ava's article, in whispered forums, in places the system couldn't touch. He didn't need evidence anymore. He needed peace. The flames flickered in his eyes as the plastic curled, data becoming smoke. He whispered one final line to the fire, soft and certain. I'm not yours anymore. It wasn't meant for Matthew. It was meant for the machine. The cartel. The myth of justice he had once lived by. He stepped back from the fire, the night wrapping around him like armor. There would be no justice. No redemption. But there would be freedom. And sometimes, That's all the truth can buy. Julian wandered into town once a week. Just to see people. Not to speak. Just to remember that he wasn't completely gone. He'd sit in the corner of a cafe, sip burnt coffee, and watch lives unfold. A woman reading to her son. A student editing a resume. A man nervously preparing for a date. Ordinary lives. Lives still living under the illusion that the system protects them. He didn't envy them. But he remembered being them. He wondered what version of him still existed in the minds of others. The lawyer? The friend? The ghost? Maybe none. Maybe memory had moved on, and all that was left was this man in the corner seat, a silent witness to a truth no one wanted. He didn't need to be seen. He just needed to see. To remember what life looks like when it's still untouched. One afternoon, he saw a girl that looked like Ella. Same posture. Same nervous glance over the shoulder. She sat on a bench outside the library, reading. Julian stared too long. Her eyes lifted. They met his. For a split second, the world stopped. Recognition? Memory? Or paranoia? The girl stood and walked away. No rush. Just gone. He didn't follow. He couldn't. Whether it was Ella or not didn't matter. What mattered was this: someone, somewhere, still carried what had been taken. Maybe she survived. Maybe others did too. Julian leaned back and whispered, "I hope you're free." And for the first time he wasn't saying it for himself. He was saying it for everyone who had been swallowed. The lost. The sold. The erased. Some nights Julian dreamed of courtrooms. But not the ones from memory. In the dreams, the rooms were empty. The benches were covered in ash. The judge's chair was broken. The floor was cracked marble with names etched into it, names of the people they forgot. He'd walk to the center, barefoot, silent, and there would be no jury. No verdict. Just the echo of a voice. Sometimes Matthew's, sometimes his own, saying, "You knew." He'd wake in cold sweat, gripping the sheets like a rope. But over time he stopped fearing the dream. It wasn't punishment. It was truth. He wasn't being judged. He was remembering. And remembering is all he had. All any survivor has. It hurts. It isolates. But it keeps the truth alive, even in silence. Years passed. Quietly. Julian never returned to law. Never told his story again. But he wrote. Pages and pages that no one read. He didn't want readers. He wanted record. One night, he buried the notebooks in a tin box near the roots of a tree in the forest. Not out of fear. Out of hope. Hope that someday, someone would find it. Not to start a revolution. Just to know. To know the truth was real. That it lived. That it bled. He placed a small rock over the spot. No markings. No directions. Just one man's final entry in a system that had erased every trace of what he saw. That's the thing about systems. They never expect the ghosts to keep talking. But some do. And sometimes that's enough. In the final frame of memory, Julian sits alone on a cliffside at dawn, overlooking the misty valley below. He breathes in deep. There are no phones. No files. No names left to speak. Just knowing. Not the kind that comforts. The kind that changes everything. He closes his eyes. And in that quiet, he speaks one final line, not to the world, but to himself. A sentence he's never said aloud. A truth too sharp for courtrooms. He says, "I helped them. I didn't mean to, but I did." The wind moves gently. The camera doesn't cut away. There's no music. Just breath. Just stillness. The story doesn't end. It simply settles. In ruin, in survival, in truth. And then, it's done.